when the three women are
Yes.
together talking, they seem to feed on each other and to produce a picture of the language, the attitudes of the men that makes it sound as though the men were much more hostile and unforgiving.
Yes, and I think, so, you know, one of the things, again, is also think of the context. And so in this conversation she's having with several women, those women have somewhat different experiences. They come into the Navy Yard from different places. So you have Jean Robinson, who is a woman of color, an African-American woman, who comes into the work as a welder, having scored very high on the civil service exam.
But she's also a violinist. She's a very talented
very talented. You have Ida Pollock, who comes in. She was married and her husband joined the service, and she comes in with friends, right?
Right.
So she's coming in with a different thing, and she also comes in as a welder. And then you have Lucille Culkin, who comes in as a ship fitter, or to eventually become a ship fitter, right? And she comes in by herself. It's, you know, the thing about Lucille is, it's still, to me, there's still this kind of question about her complete decision, her decision to join this workforce.
Right.
I think some of that, I don't know, if I were interviewing her again, if I had the chance, I would kind of plumb that just a little bit more, because she just is like, oh, I'm really not sure how I did this, but it was something that I wanted to do. But she comes in differently, and so, but in that conversation, you get a kind of greater sensitivity to the experiences that the women had as individuals, because it's shaped by a sense of their identity as women.
Yes.
Whereas in a single interview, it is a much more individual experience. And then in speaking in the collective, they're like, oh, and this happened to you too? Well, yeah, this happened to me too. And so then there's like a kind of collective identity that is informing the experiences. And I think the passage where they talk about language is quite insightful. You know, that no one ever called a hammer a hammer.
I won't ask you to say what they called it. But the other thing that sort of is illuminated in that three-part discussion is racism.
Yes.
Is the way in which each woman experienced her job differently as a result of her race, and how in some instances it appeared that they stood up for each other and women socialized with each other and so on, but not always. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I know in the papers, I think Lucille writes a letter to Alfred, where she talks about this coworker, a black coworker, who had been discouraged from advancing, and you know, they tried to support her to continue to encourage her to advance so she would get into a better work situation. In the conversation, Jean Robinson tells this story about how, like, always looking on the board to see who got a raise, and never seeing her name, right?
Right.
And then she had, like, I guess a supervisor who kind of helped her. And I think, you know, in that context, you know, Ida says, you know, reflecting back, working at the Navy Yard really kind of awakened me to how women, I think she says, you know, racism, classism, sexism, all shape the experiences that they had. And so I think it is in these conversations, is in these oral histories that provide, again, with time to reflect back, and to reflect back from a context that has opened up spaces for considering these kinds of disparities, that people like Lucille and Jean and Ida are able to look back and say, oh, that's what that was. Right?
Yes, and I think that's intriguing, because of course at the moment when it was happening, I don't think they could even have labeled it. They couldn't have said this is racism or this is classism.
Correct.
But 30 years later or 40 years later, and looking back in the context of a civil rights movement and a women's movement and so on, they can look back and see what happened. And yet, now speaking as a historian, the final question, so how do you interpret that as a historian? Do you say, well, those women in the 1940s were not aware of race or racism, or that they were aware of it in a different kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things as a historian is that we are very skeptical of the idea of things being new.
Yes, indeed.
But we do think, though, at least my premise is that it is probably not new, but the name of it probably is new. So I think that these women, in looking at the papers, in listening to Lucille's recollection of the past, like there is this sense that something was amiss, something was awry, and work to address it. I mean, some of the things are very explicit. You know, when she talks about the classification that only women received was a classification that was essentially designed to justify disparities in pay, right?
That was calling them helpers.
Exactly. But so I think that there was an awareness there. There was a involvement in the union. She talks about the work with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, like industrial unionism, and why some people, men, really wanted to keep craft unionism in place, and this was, so the difference, of course, being industrial unionism is organized around the entire industry, whereas craft unionism, people argued, well, what I do, my skill is different than your skill, so we have different interests, and that might be true in certain trades, but oftentimes it was used as a kind of gatekeeper function to keep people out who did not have quote unquote skilled or identifiably skilled skill sets to come into the labor force. And so she maybe is not having like the most sophisticated analysis of this, but she's clear that this is a barrier.
Right. That's fascinating, and of course it helps us to understand what happens after the war when the men unite around their crafts, and those without membership in the craft, one way or the other, quickly get eliminated from the workforce.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. This has been really illuminating.
Thank you for having me.